My name is Harper. I'm 68 years old, and I used to think I understood what love looked like. I believed it wore warm smiles, offered second chances, and showed up on your birthday with your favorite pie. That morning, I woke up with a little flutter in my chest. It was my birthday, and despite everything, I felt hopeful. I had done my hair, picked out a soft blue cardigan, and even set out the good china just in case we had cake later. My daughter, Claire, called just after 10. Her voice was cheerful, almost too cheerful, and she told me to get dressed. She said she made a reservation at a cozy little cafe just outside the city. I didn't question it. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and I was just happy she remembered. I rode in the passenger seat of her car, watching the trees blur past the window. She asked if I was feeling okay, said I looked tired, and asked if I'd taken my meds. I told her I felt fine, and she smiled but didn't say anything back. That silence stayed with me. We didn't drive toward any part of town I recognized. The roads grew quieter, more rural. I told myself maybe it was a new spot she'd found, something trendy and hidden. But when we turned into that long driveway, lined with birch trees and a rusted iron gate, my heart dropped. There was a sign at the entrance, gold letters etched into dark stone. Willow Haven Senior Living. Claire slowed the car. She didn't look at me. I felt my hands begin to shake. I asked where we were, but I already knew. She parked the car and turned toward me. Her smile brittle now, voice soft, like you'd use on a child. She said things about safety, about peace of mind, about how she couldn't do it alone anymore. I stared at her, and all I could think was, this is how I disappear. Not with an accident, or an illness, or old age, but with paperwork and polite words, signed behind my back by the one person I thought would never let me go. The sun was soft that morning, the kind of light that makes everything look prettier than it really is. Claire showed up at my door in a beige coat and oversized sunglasses, holding a single tulip wrapped in brown paper. She kissed my cheek and said we had a reservation just outside town, someplace quiet and lovely. I asked what kind of food they had, and she just smiled and said I'd love it. Her answers were short, rehearsed almost, but I brushed them off. Maybe she was just nervous, or tired, or trying to keep it a surprise. The ride was calm. Too calm. No music playing, just the faint sound of tires rolling over pavement. Claire kept her eyes on the road. Every time I tried to bring up something light, an old memory, her childhood birthdays, she nodded, but never added anything. The farther we drove, the quieter it got. Houses thinned out, replaced by fields and long stretches of tree-lined road. I started to feel it then, a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a low thrum of something wrong pressing on my ribs. I looked over at her hands on the steering wheel. They were still. Too still. Claire was always fidgeting when she drove, tapping her fingers to music, drumming the wheel with her thumbs. But not today. We turned down a long driveway. The trees arched overhead, their branches bare but elegant. Like something out of a painting, there was a stillness in the air that didn't feel peaceful. It felt staged. I sat up straighter in my seat. The road was too smooth, too well kept. The landscaping is too perfect. And then, I saw it. A large stone sign sat just beyond the gate. Willow Haven Senior Living. My breath caught. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe we were picking someone up. Maybe this was part of the surprise. Claire pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine. She didn't look at me. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a small overnight bag. That bag was mine. I knew the pattern, the worn leather handle. I kept it at the top of my closet. My hands began to tremble. I asked what we were doing here, and she finally turned to face me. Her voice was soft, like talking to a fragile glass. She said this wasn't sudden. She said she'd talked to people, made arrangements, and signed the papers. She said it was for my own good. I stared at her, as the air around me seemed to disappear. My ears rang. My stomach sank so low, I thought it might never rise again. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't move. This wasn't brunch. This wasn't a surprise. It was a goodbye I didn't agree to. The doors at Willow Haven slid open with a hiss, and the scent hit me first. Antiseptic, overcooked carrots, and something else I couldn't name. A woman in lavender scrubs greeted Claire by name, not me. That told me everything I needed to know. They spoke over me like I wasn't there. Claire handed her a file folder, nodded toward me, then stepped back. I asked what was happening. Claire placed a hand on my shoulder, told me she'd explain later. But she didn't. She left. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and that was the last sound I heard from the world I used to know. A nurse walked me down a hallway, all beige walls and pastel art, and showed me a room that smelled like stale laundry. She smiled too widely and called me sweetie. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and didn't say a word. Later, when I asked for my phone, the nurse told me it had been disconnected. Claire had said I got confused too easily, that the phone was making me anxious. I asked to call my bank, and she said Claire had taken over as my legal guardian. My accounts were no longer accessible. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a chart. A list of medications. A signature on a form I didn't remember signing. That night, I lay awake in a bed that creaked every time I breathed. The ceiling above me was yellowed from age, and the vent rattled whenever the heater kicked in. I stared into the dark and replayed every recent conversation with Claire, trying to find the moment I had lost her. I thought about the way she'd begun finishing my sentences for me. How she repeated the same questions, then told me I had already answered them. How she sighed when I forgot little things, like the day of the week or where I'd left my glasses. At first, I believed her. I thought maybe I was slipping. Maybe I really was. Forgetting more than I should. But the more I thought, the more it didn't add up. I hadn't gotten lost. I hadn't left the stove on. I hadn't done anything reckless. And yet, here I was, locked away with no phone, no money, no voice. The nurses were kind, but in that way people are when they've already decided who you are. They called me honey and darling, and helped me tie my shoes, even though I didn't need help. They didn't ask about my life before this place. They didn't know I once ran my own bookstore, or that I still read the paper every morning with a pencil in hand for the crossword. They looked at my hair, my hands, the lines on my face, and assumed the story was over. But it wasn't, because while they were busy talking to each other, treating me like furniture, I was listening, watching, remembering. I wasn't losing my mind. I was finding something much more dangerous. I was finding the truth. It started with a mop bucket and a quiet glance. Luis pushed his cart down the hall every morning at 7 sharp. Never saying much, just humming old tunes under his breath. But one morning, he paused outside my door, looked at me for a long moment, and asked if I was doing all right. I said I was fine. He tilted his head, then asked again, slower this time. I hesitated, then said nothing, just looked at him, until he nodded once, like he understood. That's when it began. Luis didn't wear a name tag, but his uniform was always clean, and his shoes were too nice for this job. He never asked too many questions, but he started stopping by more often, leaving the mop leaning against the door and whispering a few words. I listened closely every time. One afternoon, he slipped me a small piece of paper folded into fourths. It had a room number on it, and the words, storage files, written in crooked pen. He told me the night staff kept old patient files there. Records, forms, signatures, everything was still on paper. I waited until after lights out. I left my slippers by the bed and wrapped myself in my robe, moving slowly, and hunched like they expected me to. I passed 2 nurses, eyes low, smile blank. They didn't look twice. The door was unlocked. The room smelled like dust and mildew. Metal filing cabinets lined the wall. I ran my fingers across the labels. Some names I recognized from the breakfast table. Others were strangers. Then I found mine. The file was thicker than I expected. Pages and pages, clipped together. I flipped through until I saw the first signature. My name was dated 2 months ago. The sale of my house. The deed transfer. A copy of my ID. Perfect. Except for the part I never gave anyone. The signature looked like mine. Too much like mine. But I hadn't signed that. I knew it. I had never agreed to sell my house. Never saw those papers. Never sat in that office. I felt my breath catch. My fingers trembled. Not from fear, but from fury. Luis had been right. Something wasn't just wrong. It was calculated. Intentional. Someone had forged my name. I slipped the copies into my robe pocket and closed the drawer. I walked back to my room the same way I came. Hunched and quiet. When I lay down, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and made a promise. They thought I was too old to fight back, but they had no idea who I used to be, and they definitely didn't know who I was about to become. The second time I slipped into the records room, I knew what to look for. Luis had left a key under the mop sink, hidden beneath an old bottle of bleach. I waited until the hallway was quiet, then crept down with a flashlight in my pocket and a notebook tucked inside my robe. The files weren't alphabetized like I expected. They were sorted by something else. Case numbers, maybe. Each one had tabs marked with legal terms I barely understood. Guardianship transfers, durable power of attorney, asset liquidation. My stomach tightened with each drawer I opened. I found one file that didn't belong to a resident anymore. A woman named Esther Bell. It had been 6 months since she had passed. Inside her file was a checklist. Typed and highlighted. Phone disconnected. Bank contact changed. Home sold. Proceeds directed to a trust. I kept reading and felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't a nursing home. It was a transition chamber. A place where people like me got erased on paper before anyone noticed we were missing. Each file had a familiar rhythm. The resident arrives. A relative takes control. Within weeks, everything they own disappears. Legally. I opened a folder marked Facility Compliance. The top page had a letterhead I recognized. Crestline Group Holdings. My heart stopped. That was Claire's company. She'd worked there for years, in the legal department. She always said it was boring. Paperwork. Mergers. Nothing to talk about. I flipped to the final page. It was a memo. Internal use only. It outlined a pilot program streamlining the guardianship process for seniors in high-risk categories. The facility was one of the test sites. Willow Haven. My name was listed as a participant. I couldn't breathe. Claire hadn't just abandoned me here. She'd helped design the system that made it possible. She'd watched it happen to others, helped write the policies, signed the damn memos. And then she brought me here. I stared at the paper until my vision blurred. Not from age, from disbelief, from rage. I thought I'd lost my daughter to stress, to resentment, maybe to fear, but I hadn't lost her. She'd walked away willingly. Worse, she'd used me. The betrayal didn't hit like a slap. It settled in like frost under the skin, cold and slow and final. I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm. When I walked back to my room that night, I no longer saw the beige walls or the floral curtains. I saw chains, invisible but tight, and I knew this wasn't about me anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced with a smile and pushed into the shadows. They'd picked the wrong woman to bury quietly. Luis handed me the lottery ticket like it was a joke. He found it wedged behind a radiator while cleaning an old room. Said it probably belonged to someone who'd passed or forgotten. It was a little crumpled, the ink smudged, numbers barely visible. I almost threw it away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop spinning through papers, policies, and the hollow echo of Claire's voice justifying what she'd done. I sat in the lounge alone and typed in the numbers on the ancient computer near the vending machine. I didn't expect anything. Just wanted a distraction. When the screen loaded, I blinked, refreshed it twice. Then a third time, the numbers matched. All 6. The prize was $20 million. My breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a choke. I looked around the empty room like someone might jump out and scream, "Gotcha." It wasn't joy I felt. It was silent, the kind that holds its breath with you. I printed the page, folded it tight, and slid it into the hem of my slipper for the walk back to my room. The paper crinkled with every step, like it was whispering that nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, I asked Luis if he knew a lawyer who didn't flinch easily. He did. Within a week, I'd transferred the winnings into a blind trust under a new name. Nothing led back to me. Not the account, not the signature, not even the mailing address. Then I made a phone call. Not to Claire, not to anyone she knew. I called a business broker. Told him I wanted to buy a controlling interest in a mid-sized healthcare holding company. The name I gave him was Crestline Group Holdings. No one at Willow Haven knew. They still saw an old woman in a pink cardigan reading by the window. But I wasn't their patient anymore. I was their future majority shareholder. And I had just begun writing the ending myself. The lobby of Crestline Group Holdings was colder than I remembered. Polished marble floors, glass walls, and the kind of silence that hums with money. I wore a gray suit and low heels, hair pulled back, no makeup. I didn't need armor. I brought the truth. At the reception desk, I gave my name, the one on the trust. The assistant blinked, then picked up the phone. Minutes later, 2 executives stepped into the lobby, both trying to mask the confusion in their eyes. I was escorted to the boardroom without a word. The meeting had already started. Claire was seated near the end of the table, flipping through a folder. She looked up, saw me, and froze. Her mouth parted slightly, not in greeting. In disbelief, I walked to the head of the table, handed the assistant a folder, and took my seat. Inside the folder were the purchase records. A controlling stake. Silent until now. I turned to the board and spoke calmly. I told them I had reviewed their facilities. Specifically, Willow Haven. I laid out the evidence, the patterns, the predatory transfers, the fraud. Claire tried to interrupt. I raised one hand and kept speaking. I told them who had signed off on the guardianship pilot program, who had processed the paperwork, who had access to every file. The room went quiet. By the end of the day, Claire's badge had been revoked. Her access terminated. The guardianship filed in my name had been overturned in court within 48 hours. A judge called it reckless misuse of power and removed her as my legal contact permanently. No shouting, no revenge speech, just signatures and silence. When I left that office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt balanced, like something long tilted had finally been set straight. They had written me off as frail, confused, finished. But I was never finished. I was just waiting for the right page to turn. The cabin sits at the edge of a quiet lake in Vermont. The porch creaks when I step outside each morning, coffee in hand, watching mist rise from the water like breath from something sleeping. No schedule, no one knocking, just me, a garden, and enough peace to hear myself think again. I started a foundation with the trust money. It funds legal aid for seniors placed under guardianship without consent. It's small now but growing, and every letter I get from someone who's been heard for the first time reminds me why I did it. Claire sent a letter. Apologies, explanations. Regret. Wrapped in careful language. I didn't open it. Some things are better left unread. I've already grieved what I needed to, and forgiven what I won't forget. There's no anger left in me, just space. And purpose. They tried to bury me, but I was the seed.